Welcome back to Grace Stories. We are so glad that you joined us, watching us, listening. Once again, I've seen a good response. You guys are liking videos and you're, sharing them and watching them and subscribing and following us, and that helps a ton. The more people we can get to do this, the better it's going to be on the back end for us. And so I just want to say thank you again for continuing to do that. And sharing this with people. It's sometimes hard to find this kind of stuff, especially on Facebook, even if you are following us. So the more that you push for notifications and things like that, the easier it'll be to find us, whether it's this podcast or if it's just us sharing news about what's going on here at the church. But with all of that said, this week I wanted to bring Mike on. He just preached about grief, and we went through that in his sermon, talked about some of those aspects of the story with Lazarus. And so there are some different things I thought we could explore, kind of diving a little deeper into that, but also maybe into some other aspects of what this looks like in people's lives, or even our own experiences with it. And with all of that said, Mike, one of the first questions that I have for you is, we can see different things in the story, but there might be some questions people are asking themselves after hearing that story. Different things like, why would Jesus willingly allow Lazarus to die? Why would he wait in response? Where do I find myself in that story? Do I find myself, in the place of Mary or Martha, and how do I wrestle with some of that stuff? And so is there anything, in preparing for the sermon that you kind of spent time looking at and researching and wrestling with yourself?
Yeah, I think there is kind of a big loaded question that I kind of reference a little bit in the sermon, but obviously there's a lot to this story that in a 30-minute sermon you can't go into. You kind of got to choose your lane on what you're going to follow. And my main concern with the sermon was about Mary's response, and I refer to her I talked to her about, I call her Messy Mary sometimes, because I think she would come off to us as being kind of a mess. And in multiple places, when you see her through Scripture, she's somebody that kind of creates these faux pas sometimes in situations that make people uncomfortable. And her approach to Jesus is that way. And so I wanted to focus on the messiness of how we deal with grief really well. But there is a bigger implication, and I think a lot of John's focus when he tells the story of Lazarus, he walks through and he does not let you get away from the tension of what's happening when Jesus gets word in John 11 that Mary and Martha sent word that their brother Lazarus was sick. And he says that now Jesus loved Mary and Martha, loved Lazarus. And so when he found out that he was sick, he waited 2 more days. And he connects those things so closely. He makes it very clear that that's why Jesus waited, which sometimes we lose, because when we hear the name Lazarus, we have that's synonymous with resurrection. We start that story, oh, this is about Lazarus. Oh, it's the resurrection story. We know the happy ending of that, and so we may miss, when we read it, the tension that John is creating. If you didn't know how it ended, it's a really uncomfortable story to read, because he makes very clear 2 things: how much Jesus loves them, and the fact that Jesus knowingly and deliberately let Lazarus die. He let them watch their brother die, knowing these people who he knew and loved, he was very close to. He stayed in their house. So he's probably, 15 to 20 miles away. So in a walking culture, that would have been a day's journey for him to get down from where he was out in kind of the wilderness where John was baptizing, it says, and they were down in Bethany. So, it would have taken him a day to walk there, but he waited 2 days intentionally, and I suspect probably then stayed, even when he did come down, stayed in Jerusalem, because he'd been in the tomb for 4 days by the time Jesus showed up. And if John didn't give you certain details, you might think, well, maybe Jesus just didn't realize how serious it was. Maybe he didn't know how sick he really was. He thought, oh, he'll make it. Maybe Jesus has more important things to do and he just couldn't get there any quicker. Or, maybe Jesus isn't really that close to them and he, kind of doesn't see it as a priority. But none of those things, John doesn't let you believe any of those things. He makes it very clear because Jesus makes statements to the disciples that, when he's talking to the disciples, he says, we're going to go and we're going to see him, and Lazarus is asleep, and they say, oh, if he's asleep, he'll get better. And Jesus' response is, no, Lazarus is dead. and for your sake, I'm glad I was here. That he said, I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there so that you may believe, but let us go to him. Jesus is making very bluntly clear that he knows exactly what he's doing. That Lazarus is dying, he's dead now, and I waited intentionally until he died before I showed up, which is really uncomfortable. But what I love about that story is that's the situation in doing counseling for a number of years, I saw people walk through those kind of scenarios over and over again where they desperately cried out for help. Oh, God, please heal this person. Please save this person. Please help in this situation. I think I'm going to lose my job. Please help me not to lose my job. And they lose their job. And it feels like Jesus didn't show up. And it's like, I know I prayed fervently and I had friends around me praying for this and it didn't happen. And I lost that person anyway. What do I do with that? And I saw people whose faith didn't allow for that really devastated by it. And I saw people some seemingly very messy people who kind of like Mary, it was ugly while they were going through it, but they wrestled with it and they came out the other side as stronger and firmer in their faith. And to me, it's a matter of like, well, what does that take? Because you have to be able to answer that question of why did Jesus do that? How does he love them? And John over and over emphasizes how much he loves them. He kind of like beats you over the head with, no, Jesus really, really loved them. Jesus loved them. Now he loved Mary and Martha. It's like he's overemphasizing that to make sure it's not that he doesn't care about them either. He loves them very much. And so he's letting them sit here and grieve and watch their brother die and bury him. And then he shows up in Bethany and you're like, what's going on? And to me, that's the root of why you see Mary respond and Martha respond the way they do, because they come out to him and they said, Jesus, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. I've seen you heal people. And I know you knew because we sent word to you. And I know you knew days ahead of time. Why didn't you show up? Because I think of this on a personal level. If I knew a friend of mine was sick and I had the ability to heal them, somebody that I really cared about, somebody in my family or one of my close friends, and I'm a day away and they say, hey, you have the ability to go and heal that person and make them better. And I love that person. I'd be there, right? Like, I wouldn't be like, I got other things to do. It's a weird response from a human standpoint that sounds either very callous. People would assume, well, you don't care. And I think Jesus cared very much about that. And what I think you see when you come around to the side of the resurrection and you get to that point of Jesus walks up and he's weeping with them and comes to the tomb and he says, Lazarus, come out. There's that point of, Jesus just comes up and speaks, and Lazarus, who they cared for, this is their brother, that they were there with him in the house, tending to him, nursing him, helping him, all down to the point in which he died. They did all the burial preparations. They put him in the tomb. They were intimately involved in that whole process, so they know he's dead. This wasn't, we found this guy, he seems to be dead. Well, maybe he was just unconscious. This isn't that situation, because they were there hands-on the entire process. And to have grieved and gone through that. And then for Jesus with, saying, Lazarus, come out. And he gets up and walks out of the tomb. That's one of those, it helps you understand. I mean, we already know, like, to raise the dead already, for most of us, we have no concept of somebody being able to do that. But in their situation, this wasn't just witnessing something happen. This was intimately involved in it. And he let them go through the heavy part of that, because on the other side of it, there was something powerful that he was trying to do spiritually with them. And to see Lazarus walk out, I compare it a lot. It's similar to the reaction of the disciples when they're on a storm. The disciples are in a storm and Jesus is asleep, and they wake him up, and Jesus rebukes the wind and the waves, and the storm stops. The disciples go, "Who is this that the wind and the waves obey him?" There's this moment of like, wait, who are we with here? Because disciples in the past, you'd have prophets and different people who healed. It was seen as a miraculous thing, but not a completely unique thing. When they would see that as power from God when he came and he healed people. But you could go back to Elijah and different things. They had records of people in the past who were from God that God used to heal people. So I think they could have easily seen him as just another teacher, just another prophet, as from God, but maybe not unique. And so when he walked up, though, to the tomb with their brother, that they had watched him die and buried him, and Jesus, with a word, he comes out. It's something categorically different than anything they had a concept for. So comparable to that storm that he obeys, or comparable to the transfiguration when, they hear the Father speak, about him, and they see him transform before them. There's these moments of Jesus revealing who he really is, that he's not just a guy with wise words. He's not just a good rabbi and a great teacher. He's not just a prophet or somebody with a healing ability. There's something else going on. And so when Jesus decides, he's gifting them with this powerful awareness and a firsthand experience that any of us, would love to have. God, show me, who you really are. We would love to have that experience of like this proof of God doing something so unbelievable in our midst. But oftentimes the only way we get there is they had to go through this horrible, gut-wrenching experience to get there. And it's like, okay, we would never choose that pathway. And that's why I think it's a loving act by Jesus, but not the kind of love we're used to. And I think I said it's a severe kind of love, and it's that's saying, I'm willing to take you through this really awful experience because on the other side there is something really powerful that's going to happen through it. Like most of the time, I think if we knew what it would take to get there, we'd be like, "That's all right, I'll pass." He knows that, like, if he tells Mary and Martha, "This is what's going to take to get to really know me," they sort of, like, that's all right. We'll let Lazarus live. Like they would not have probably chosen that. And so it still boggles the mind. I don't know that there's a way to understand that, because I feel like this is where you get in this territory where these things exist at the same time, this kind of love and this severe, I'm going to allow you to go through something horrible, that exists at the same time. It's beyond our comprehension sometimes. And that's what I love, though, about John, is I think John, when he tells this story, leaves you with that tension. He doesn't resolve it for you. It's kind of like, yeah, both of these things are true at the same time, and they don't fit in our minds. It's not a human way of thinking that's loving, and it's a really hard thing to grasp.
Yeah, I appreciate, being willing to go into a story that is not super clean, and I think that a lot of times as humans, as Christians, it's easier to find the stories that have, easy, they're clean. They're not like, there's not the paradox there of, they say this is true, but this happened, how do I reconcile some of these things? But also the fact that you, as a Christian, I think sometimes you can have this false sense of, well, God wants my life to be a certain way, or I know that God is always there, but I think that the story challenges what people's expectations of that actually is. For you personally, having a counseling background, are there people that you feel like maybe they're in the middle of that grief, but they maybe don't realize it, or they're in the middle of it, they realize it, but they're kind of struggling because they're asking themselves, where is God in that? And what what did you, tell people, or how did you work with people like that, where there's, the absence of God in the midst of their struggle and pain and grief, and what in the story, or what in your own personal experience helped begin to reconcile that for people?
I think it's not. It doesn't look pretty when you're in the middle of it. I would say when you walk long term with somebody through the process of grief, especially with some of the really heavy ones that I've seen, and especially with clients I've walked through. When someone loses somebody, especially when it's unexpected, I see people who lost a spouse at a really young age with little kids, or you see somebody who, people who've lost one of their children, or adult child, or whatever. There's things like that where it's just categorically different almost, and it's just gut wrenching on a level that it doesn't make any sense. And there's no way to make to kind of piece it together to where it's like, how can this be my reality? It's disorienting, and it is messy. The people who do it well will not feel like they're doing it well when they're in the middle of it, because they just think, I'm a wreck. Like I can't even control like the emotions that are coming out of me. And one day, I'm just sad and reminiscing, and then another day I'm angry, and I'm angry at God, and I don't know what to do with all that. I've never felt this way before. I can't even control my emotions. They're all over the place, especially the early phases of it. And just feeling like I can't even function, or I can't get out of bed, or I can't, people, it just affects every aspect of their physical and emotional being. And so when you see people in the middle of that walk through it, and see people who come out the other side, to me, I think it's the people who really, I titled my message, Walk Through the Darkness. It's really a kind of a courageous choice to just walk right through the middle of it, because we have so many ways of trying to avoid it, compartmentalize it. I've seen, one of the passages I was tempted to really go into that I just didn't have time either is 2 Samuel 12, where you see David as he's losing this child that came after the incident with Bathsheba. And so there was all that, because that he's been warned that this baby is going to die. And so he's crying out to God and praying, and he won't eat. He spends a week just out on the ground, refusing to eat, just begging God to spare the life of his child. And then the child dies. And when they come, they're afraid to tell him. They're afraid to tell David that the baby died. So like, he's been such a wreck so far. Like, what's he going to do? He's going to hurt himself if we tell him that the baby's dead. Like, we don't even know how to tell him. And there's precedent for that. David didn't respond real well to bad news sometimes. So they're afraid to even tell him. And they tell him, and his response is he gets up, dusts himself off, cleans himself up, goes and eats something, and goes back to work. It's this bizarre kind of disconnect. And I think there's an element of us that wants to be able to do that. And especially with even within the church, as a Christian, it's like, I feel like I should just have hope, and I should just trust God. And we can see that image of David saying, well, there's nothing else I can do, is basically what he says. Like, if the child's died, there's nothing else I can do now. I might as well, move on. That response, if you see it within the church, a lot of people will see that and go, wow, look at that faith. Wow, look at how amazing that is. I don't trust that most of the time. From a counseling side, when I see somebody that flips a switch and is just all better very quickly, that's a recipe that, for me, a lot of times 5 years down the road, that person is going through something really destructive. What you see in like David's life is you see all of this disconnect from his family, and there's a lot of turmoil in his family with his kids that are fighting each other and killing each other, and all kinds of craziness that develops. And David, as good as he is as a king in a lot of ways, just checks out of the family. Like, he doesn't get involved in any of it. And so you see him as this really passive, uninvolved dad that lets all that mess happen and makes it worse. So that's the kind of stuff I see. Sometimes those people will end up 5 years down the line. Now they've got a severe problem with alcohol that's developed over several years, or they've gone through, now they've had a divorce and they've walked away from stuff in their family. Or you see them just make really destructive choices, and sometimes you'll trace it back, and you'll be like, It all started with this really tragic circumstance that happened. They didn't want to talk about it. And now there's all of this mess and fallout from it and then their family. The people who do it well, I usually tell people on the simple level when they're first starting into it is you need to feel that emotion. Don't deny it. Just let it out. Whatever it is, you need to be able to just get it out. You need to grieve. You need to express all of that just junk. So there's a cathartic element to that. You need, for the Christian people I deal with, I'm telling them, you don't walk away from God at this point. It's tempting when you're angry, kind of like Mary and Martha are, like, it's like, why didn't you show up? It's easy to avoid God. I think even the well-meaning Christians will kind of avoid their relationship with God and slowly grow away from it because they're a little afraid of what they're going to find out, or they don't know that there's a good answer and they don't want to ask the question. So I tell them, whatever it is, the courage to say I'm still going to engage God and ask him, and I'm going to keep going back to him to figure out what he has to say about this situation or what he's trying to do. And then the third part is you have to have people around you. And it's the subtle thing you pick up in John 11 with Mary and Martha is it mentions a couple of times all these people that were there consoling them. And I think that's a sign, like those people, when Mary gets up to go to Jesus, they assume she's going to the tomb to weep, which means that's kind of her normal method. That's what they're there to expect. They see her get up and leave, like, oh, she's probably going to the tomb to grieve some more, which says she's being very expressive. And those people around her have been seeing that and been in there with her. And they're not doing that much, but she has people around her grieving with her. That's what the Bible talks about. We weep with those who weep, rejoice with those who rejoice. There's a huge healing in that there's people who over the long haul, not just that first couple of weeks where people bring meals and do that kind of stuff, but to say the people who 6 months later, when you're still unable to deal with, like you go through a holiday or you go through an anniversary and it just sends you back to square one. That person's like, I spent all day just weeping and I didn't even get out of bed. I didn't eat anything. I just cried all day long. It's like, are there people that'll be there in the midst of that who don't have a good answer for you, who can't answer and say, oh, it'll be okay. You know, it's those kind of those things don't work when you've lost a child or something. Like that doesn't compute. So to be able to take that and say, but I'm here and I'm just grieving with you. Yeah, it's horrible. And I don't think we're supposed to like death. I don't think we're supposed to. It's a result, biblically, it's a result that goes back to the fall. Death came because of the fall, because of sin, because of bad choices. And so it's a bad thing in this world that will eventually be eliminated. And so we're not supposed to be comfortable with it. We're not supposed to like it. Trusting God doesn't mean I say, yes, death is good. You should hate sin because God hates sin too. He hates death. These are not good things. They're just part of our existence right now that we have to deal with. And so being able to say, with that person, to just be there and face it, and I'll sit here and cry with you, it doesn't feel like you're doing very much, though, when you're doing it. You feel like there should be some big study I should be doing or some, organization I should be starting. Or like, you feel like you should be doing more than you're doing. Really, it's just the day-to-day. I keep going back. The courage it takes to just go one more day and feel all that junk all over again and remember those memories, remember the tragic things about the loss over and over and over again every day. People don't want to keep doing it. They want to leave it alone. I just want to forget that ever happened. That's where it's so easy to, like, I'm going to lose myself in, name it, whatever it is. I'm going to lose myself, whether it's drinking or drugs or whether it's, I'm just going to start watching movies on Netflix and paying no attention to my life. It doesn't have to be super bad things, but I can lose myself in my work. I can lose myself in all kinds of things that are ways of me not having to think about it, not having to feel it. But it doesn't go away. When you've got a big grief and a big loss that you've not grieved, ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It just kind of gets infected, I think, in a way. It just gets worse. And so then 5 years later, the counseling side, I've seen a lot of people come with something that they bring out the story and you kind of go, wow, that happened 10 years ago and you've never really grieved that loss. That some of them are huge. It's amazing the stuff that you hear, these families that have these tragic circumstances and then no one ever talked about it. I've heard a number of examples of, somebody passed away and, my parents, as soon as the funeral was over, we never mentioned that person's name again. Stuff like that, where you go, oh, no wonder, there's all this going on. Is that, we tried to ignore that all these years. And when you look at the ripple effect in their family, it's like now this has turned into this much bigger mess that now we've got to unpack. So it's just the day by day, I think a lot of times, willingness to say, I'm going to go ask this tough question of God. I've been wrestling with God. I know I prayed and you didn't show up. Why? Why did you show up? Like in Lazarus' case, why did you show up 4 days after we buried him when you could have been here before he even died? Why? Because if you take the resurrection piece out of that, it's very, he'd be very hard to understand. And to say, am I going to go in and say, why would you let us walk through that? Or blaming myself, God, should I have done something else to prevent that from happening? Is this my fault? Am I being judged because I had this thing that I feel guilty about? Is that the reason we're getting punished right now? All these kind of things that people wrestle with that they don't want to have to wrestle with. And so I don't know if I even want to ask God because I don't want to hear the answer of that. I'm afraid the answer you're going to give me is, yes, I'm punishing you because you're a terrible Christian or something, which is not the case. But that kind of thing, am I willing to just sit down and feel what I'm feeling and bring God into that and ask him those tough questions or tell him how angry I am at him or whatever? And I think the people who do that, it looks ugly in the early part of it. It looks messy. It looks, there's all this emotion spilling out and you don't know what's going to happen with it. But if they're doing those things, I find somewhere in there, in that process, God's doing something. And on the other hand, on the other side of it, there's this 1 year, 2 years, 5 years out. In the long game, you look back and you go, that person really grew in their faith. Now they're much stronger in their faith. Now they're this really strong person who has been really shaped and humbled by that grief. And now they're impacting other people and they're encouraging others who are going through grief in some way and all this stuff. And you look back and you go, wow, look at what God did through what's a horrible circumstance. Now God is using them in a big way. And that's what I want people to be able to get out of it, is that there can be this powerful growth that happens through a really horrible experience. I don't ever know what God's going to do with that. There's a lack of control for me from the counseling side of things too. You walk through this, you're like, I don't pretend to know what God's doing, why he did it, or what this means down the road. I don't know either. I'm just as lost as they are in the middle of it. But it's kind of like, if we keep doing this, at some point, healing happens, because I think that's the way we're designed to work. I think the body, grief is a physical and emotional experience. That's how the body heals. And the same way that your body has a way of healing physically, when you cut yourself or whatever, your blood clots and all that stuff, there's a natural way your body's designed to heal. Grief and expressing all of that and the social aspect of it is how we're designed. Like, our bodies are made to heal that way when we go through something, tragic like that. And we have to let ourselves do it. And if we don't, it doesn't heal very well.
For people that are listening, and you see stories, a lot of stories in the Bible where these sorts of things tend to revolve around, death, the loss of life, and things like that. And so I'm sure, in your, past working with clients in counseling, and probably also, maybe in your own life, or working with people, not professionally, but just being with people, do you feel like grief can only manifest itself after something like the tragic loss of life or dealing with death, or are there things that people might be going through and they don't even realize that they either should be or they are grieving over something that's not necessarily tied to losing a person?
Yeah, certainly I do. I think the situation, like the response to it, can be very similar. One of the most obvious ones is a divorce. I've walked to a number of people that end up in a divorce, especially if they didn't want it. Especially when they weren't seeking to get a divorce, but their spouse did. I've seen a lot of those. I've done a lot of marital counseling, but I've also walked with a number of people that went through a divorce and seen the impact of that. And when we look at a divorce situation, it really is the grieving of a loss of a relationship. So it feels very much like a grief. You're letting go of dreams of what you thought was going to happen in this marriage. And so there's different variations to that, but it certainly can. People who lose jobs sometimes go through a grief of, I had this vision of what I thought this job was going to be, the security that I was counting on this job to give me, and now so there's an anxiety component to that of what's going to happen in my future, but there's also often a grief component of this thing that got taken away from me. And I think anytime we lose something that we value very highly, it's a version of grief. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think people sometimes don't even realize that there's an element of grief that they need to deal with because they think, well, nobody died, so I should just be okay with it. And they want to look at, you can go through the divorce example, like the logistics of it, and they're fighting over, how are we going to fix this, custody or financial agreement, all these legal things. And I don't stop to realize that a lot of the thing that I'm having trouble with is that I just don't want to let go of this thing that's being taken away from me. This marriage, this relationship, this idea, I can't let go of it. And so I fight with all these other little things, and rather than just acknowledge that I'm grieving, is that I am just sick with grief and loss and sadness and despair over the loss of this dream, the loss of this picture, loss of this relationship and what we once had, and that kind of thing. And instead of facing that and just grieving and being sad, which feels very out of control, I try to take control to try and win it back, or to try to fix it, or to then try to punish the other person, or, well, then I'm not going to let you have this. There's all these reactions that I don't want to just stop and be really broken by how devastating this is to me and admit how much it hurts me. I've been in the role quite frequently as the counselor that it's my job to make that person feel those things. That I feel like I'm poking and prodding around that issue to get to what's really going on. I feel like I'm the bad guy who's going to put that on the table, and then you're going to have to actually think about it and be the person that triggers that grief to come out. And while that, you kind of feel bad, like from the counselor's side in the moment of bringing this sadness to the table. Often those are moments of hope for me as the counselor, because I'm like, finally, you're letting that out. When I see all of a sudden that grief come out instead of all this kind of anger or fighting or whatever, then it's like, oh, you're grieving. Here we go. Here it is. And it's like when they'll own it for what it really is, that's the thing you can really fix, because it's like, okay, we can start to work on healing grief. I can't control, your ex that's being crazy, this kind of stuff. Like, we can't necessarily fix all of that scenario, but we can walk through the emotions that you're going through and express it and get it out and start to answer some of those questions. So I think when we get into that, yeah, sometimes it's just acknowledging, and I don't think American culture is not real comfortable with lament and with grief and with just expressing negative emotions. We like the feel-good turnaround story. We like the pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's a lot of our history. And I think some of that shifting, I think there's definitely a lot more comfortability with therapy and things like that now. But oftentimes still, I find there's a discomfort with with sitting there in a grief lament kind of mode and just being there in it. We want there to be a quick fix and there to be an answer, a self-help solution, okay, well, read this book, follow these 3 steps, and it gets better. Instead of the answer is really just sit there in that grief. That's not a real comfortable answer to give people. Like, just sit here and feel it and let it out and get some people around you and grieve. It doesn't feel victorious. It feels like I'm wallowing in the mess that I'm in. But to do that well, and to own it and acknowledge that I'm just grief-stricken is a powerful thing. And often the healing and the relationships that are built out of that and the things that come forward from it usually there's powerful things that come on the other end. And that's where to see that through with people is a powerful thing, and to see God work in it is really amazing.
Yeah, one of the things that I thought about as you're talking through is in the Old Testament there's lots of laments, whether it's from the prophets or whether it's in the poetic books, and you can see them wrestling with a loss of their home, a loss of their security, a loss of maybe it is a person or a relationship, but maybe it's just the nation being taken to a place unknown.
Yeah.
And wondering where God is in the moment, and you can go through some of those and there's no resolution. It's I'm in the midst of it, but I'm confident in the fact that I know that God will ultimately work things out in the end, whatever that looks like. And I think that that's probably true for a lot of people now, where they're wondering, even especially now with a lot of the things that are going on for people financially, whether it's school starting up, whether it's, a way of life that someone's used to that's not necessarily there anymore, and having to do different things that they just aren't used to, or things that they were looking forward to that now they don't have that thing anymore, whether it's a football game or a birthday party. And I think a lot of people are probably wrestling through different levels of that. And in the story here, and I'm sure that you've maybe experienced this as well, I think too often we just want to find the way to fix it and make it go back to the way it was. How do you work with or talk with people who they're not coming to you to help them walk through it? They're wanting you to fix it and just turn it around. And I feel like in this story, when you have them, coming to Jesus and saying he's dying, it's not come be with us as we're processing his death, but it's come and just change it and make it not happen.
Yes, please heal him so we don't have to go through this. I think that's what they're doing, is crying out and saying, God, please don't let us go through this. Please don't let him die. And yeah, I think that's almost universal. Like, no one wants to go through when they face real heavy grief. And like I said, even if it's not the death of a person, that's one of the most powerful ones usually that I see. But yeah, even if it's something else like a divorce or a job loss, or even now, like you said, there's subtle things that we think, it's too trivial. Why am I so upset that I can't go work out the way I used to? It just feels like such a silly thing to be so upset about. But it was very central to how I coped with things, and now that's disrupted, and it's made me very anxious, right? So some of it's just our routine. I think we're facing it. I think some of the element of church that people, for a lot of people who can't come to church, and even those who are, coming here for service in person, the percentage of those that are there, it feels different still. It's like, even if you're coming in person, because of what we have to do for safety and stuff like that, you're not getting a bulletin when you come in, and we don't have some of these things up that we normally do, and we haven't done communion yet the way we've done before. And so it's like you come in and you notice it's different. And even though it didn't go back to normal, it just hasn't. So even those little things, it's like part of my routine and the way I worshiped or the way I gathered with people, this Bible study I used to go to, and now we can't because all the people are vulnerable and we can't meet in person. We're doing it over Zoom, but it's not the way it used to be. It's like all those things can trigger a little bit of that grief. And yeah, the human reaction, I mean, we just want it to go back to normal. Don't make me go through that, which is why it's the loving act of Jesus to drag that person through something we would never choose to go through. And he knows you need to go through the pain to see what I've got on the other side. It takes often someone else to give them the courage to do that. I think from a counseling side, when they come in, sometimes it's an honest conversation of saying, I can't fix that. And being honest with them, like, no, none of the things you're going to do are going to fix that situation. You can't put that back together. And to say, and because oftentimes there's a lot of elements out of your control, and to say like, okay, yeah, my marriage is falling apart and my spouse wants to leave and they're filing for divorce. And we can say, well, I can't make that other person decide that they want to stay with you. I've had a lot of people in that state come to me who are at a desperate point and trying to fix their marriage. And as I've done, did a lot of the relationship side of stuff. And, you come in and you're like, I can help you work on some things that you're like your part in that. And there's certainly things that like, yes, I can work with you and help you do communication well or something like that. I can help you handle some of the things you were not handling well. But I can't say that the other person's going to believe you. If we say we're trying to rebuild trust because we had this damaging incident happen in our marriage and we're trying to rebuild trust. And it's like, well, I can't make that person trust you, and there's nothing you can do that makes that person trust you. There's a choice they have. So I usually have to help them see that there are pieces that are out of your control that I can't guarantee an outcome. And so you have to be willing to sit with that, to say, I don't know if I can make sure it all gets better. And when someone offers that formula, and whether that's from the church side, there's the temptation to fall into if you have enough faith and you pray this way, God's going to do what you want. It's kind of that health and wealth gospel element, prosperity theology. When you go there, I compare it's like a vending machine. And it's really tempting and really appealing that if I can get the formula right, Jesus will do what I want him to do. That's what I love about the Lazarus story is it kind of goes against that formula. There's no getting Jesus to do what you want. Because what they wanted was him to come and heal Lazarus and not have to let him die. They didn't want what Jesus gave them. We can look in retrospect and say, that's amazing. Like they got this resurrection story, their brother back from the dead kind of thing, and go, wow, that's awesome. But they had to walk. They didn't know that was coming. Jesus did ahead of time. He lets us know that he knows what he's getting ready to do, but they didn't know that. And so to walk through the middle of that and say, what Jesus is giving me may be better in some respects in terms of my spiritual growth, in terms of my impact on people. He may allow me to do something that is really powerful and have a powerful impact on somebody. I may, be able to do real good in this world in a way that I couldn't when I wasn't broken by this horrible thing I went through. That's some of our most powerful, impactful people are shaped by suffering they went through. And so we want to have the impact that those people had. Or I want to be this influential person. I really want to help people. I care about people and I want to have an impact. We see that within the church a lot. And it's like, do you want the suffering that person went through in order to become that person? That's the hard part. That Jesus has to sometimes drag us through that, that we have to embrace this hard thing that just got dumped on me, that now I'm going to have to face, and I don't want that to be my story. It's hard to come to grips with it. And so for me, often it's the answer of saying the hope that I'm going to give somebody, and some of them, that's not what they want, and they may leave. They may not come back. I've had plenty of those too. People come a couple times, they're not getting the formula from me, and they don't call back. And so some of them will choose to leave, and that's okay. But the hope that I'm giving them when I'm talking with them, my hope is not that this issue will go the way you want it to go. This thing will get fixed. I don't know that, and I don't pretend to know that with people. But what I want them to know is there is hope regardless, whether this issue gets fixed, whether this person gets better, your family member that has cancer, and you're like, it's not looking good. The doctors say there's nothing we can do about it, and we're praying about this. And, whichever way that goes, to know that God is good anyway, and that he has a good plan. I don't know what that is. And I'm hoping that his plan is to heal that person. I'm hoping that, that your marriage will be healed and it'll come back together. But I don't know that piece. But I know that on the other side, there's going to be real good, and he will take care of you through it and empower you through it, and you're going to be stronger. So that's the thing. I know who he is, and it's like what God's character is. And that's what we see throughout the Lazarus story. He does love them. He is powerful and able to do all these things. You see his power, his love, his grace, mercy, all coming through in big ways in that story, even though his actions don't make a lot of sense from a human standpoint. And so it's that I don't know what he's doing makes no sense with my life, but there's a power in knowing who he is. I know how much he cares about me. He's shown me that in many ways. I know how powerful he is. They knew that. He can heal people. He can fix this. He can totally undo this mess. And I know also that the way he's choosing, if I'm asking sincerely and begging him to fix this, and he says no, it's because it's better for me that he say no, as hard as that is. Because I see it as a parent now with little kids. Like, I have to sometimes say no to them on things they really, really want, and they're like, why can't we watch that today? Why can't we? And I'm looking at the long term. We're looking at the betterment of our kids and making decisions for them and what's healthy for them and what's good for them, and saying, no, we can't have chicken nuggets for every meal, sometimes it's silly stuff like that. Or we can't just watch, cartoons all day long. You need to do other things. Read a book. And you see it when it's children, and they get upset about something, and they're like, I just want this, I want this, I want this, and they want so badly to have this thing, and you realize, but it isn't good for them. As much as it seems nice and they'll enjoy it and they'll be happy, this is something I know they don't need. That it's better for them not to have it. It's better for them to learn how to entertain themselves and play a game and not just watch TV all this time, right? And you realize that's the position that God is in with us, that sometimes he has to walk us through some things that we don't really want. And we would never ask for, we would never choose on our own. And he lovingly says, no, in the midst of this broken world, this is exactly what you need to be close to me. This is exactly what you need to grow as a person and to be the person you're wanting to be, or to have the impact you want to have. For me, you're going to have to walk through this painful experience. Just like he says to, it's kind of like he says to Saul, after Saul goes through this thing on the road to Damascus where Jesus appears to him and blinds him, and the message he gives, Ananias is this disciple of Christ who's coming to heal the blind eyes and kind of commission Paul to go into ministry. And the message he gives to him is, tell him how much he must suffer for my name. It's like, that's quite a commissioning at the beginning of your conversion experience, to follow Jesus. And his commission is, tell him how much he's got to suffer for me. It's like, ooh, like that's not a pretty message. I don't like that. And to me, that's for me as a counselor. Sometimes I get put in that point of, I've got to give you the honest answer. Is God is good and loving, but sometimes it's this severe love that he's walking you through something that maybe you don't want to have to face. But I have to lovingly tell you the truth that maybe we need to just walk through this. Maybe we just need to grieve instead of trying to prevent it. And it just takes a discernment sometimes to know the difference. But it's all the time. Like this is walking through human suffering all the time. When you're doing counseling, it's like this is the territory you end up trying to inhabit all the time.
Yeah, that makes me think of people. There's writers that I've read, like Henry Nouwen, that talk about ministry of presence and absence that God can have with a person, whether that's through the Holy Spirit or these actual examples in the gospel with Jesus. And it also makes me think about in the way there's you see both of those. There's the ministry of Jesus's absence during the midst of their suffering, and then obviously the presence when he's there and he's expressing those same emotions, because he's going through the grief just, like they are, when he's weeping and he's sad, because he does love them.
Yeah.
And I think too often as Christians, we look at stories like that, or we look at stories like Job, and we see the loss, but we skip to the end when things are all, back to normal. And it's like, I want God to do that thing. I want, or to think that he's always going to operate in that way. Well, I see these stories, so it means that he's going to do that. And I think that can be a challenge for us as well. So, thinking about the end of the story and people that are coming out of that grief, or they've learned to wrestle with some of their emotions. What is it like long term to actually, wrestle with that grief, and then to be kind of through it, and from a counseling standpoint, when do you feel like people are through the grief?
Yeah, I think it's, I would say it's very up and down in the midst of it. When I see somebody really deep in grief, there's an up and down nature to it. And you see over the long haul, you'll see better. So like 6 months out, people will look back and say, I'm a lot better off than I was 6 months ago. When this first happened, I couldn't even get out of bed, or I was just crying all day long. I wasn't eating anything. And now I have those moments, but I have times in between where I can be happy a little bit, or, and so there's this, I might have days or moments where I go through a day that was special, a birthday or an anniversary. I might have even just simple little things that set me off, where I hear, a commercial on TV, or I hear a song that was special to that person, or, whatever. So somebody can have something like that, where I've been doing really well all week. I've been feeling really good, and I've been healthy. I've been back to work, and I've been doing things, and I felt good, all week. And then I heard that song on the radio, and the rest of the day I was a complete wreck. And I felt as bad as I did the day it happened. It's like all that came back. And what they'll come in, usually on the counseling side, they'll come in saying, I feel like I'm back to square one. And they feel very defeated. Like, how am I feeling just as rotten and grief-stricken as I was on day one? I've made no progress. And I have to be able to say, no, you are making progress. That's not abnormal to feel as low as you were. The growth is you're having less and less of those days. And when you have that low point, you're able to grieve and cry and journal or do whatever you do. You've got tools, you've got people that are supporting you. And so you go to those, you take some time and you deal with it, but then you're able to kind of get back on your feet. And maybe the next day you start to feel back to normal again. And so those don't last as long. They're not going all day long. It's not a week straight of just barely even able to eat anything. So they're able, and I have to help them look back and go, remember how you were when this first happened a year ago. Remember how low you were and how often you felt that way, and how you didn't feel like you couldn't even get out of that. Now you kind of know how to get out of it. You can go there, feel it, grieve it, ask those questions, journal about it. And then there's a point where you've kind of like, okay, I got it out. And yeah, I can do this. Okay. And then you get back on track, right? It's often this up and down, but they have more and more times of feeling better. And this up and down, but over the long arc of it, you see it getting better. And then those moments are less and less frequent. So usually there's things that happen like anniversaries, or I might go through Thanksgiving and, Thanksgiving was really special with that person. And so, Thanksgiving's just so horrible this year because I'm missing them all the time. It's very visceral. So you'll see that kind of up and down over the course of time. And what I'll tell people too is that it never goes away. When it's a real grief, a deep wound like that, and a person, a person you really loved or that you lose, it doesn't go away. The healing is more. I'll talk about the difference between kind of an open wound and a scar. It's like the scar will still be there, but it's not this overwhelming open wound anymore. It's something that I remember. It's still a painful memory. There's still sad parts of that. I see people who lost, especially when they lose someone really close to them or something, the really tragic ones, that years and years later will still say, it's still, when I think about it, it's this just, there's this rock in my stomach that is like, it makes me sick that we lost this person or that happened. And so that will still be there, but it's a difference of there's a strength that has grown in the healing that now, because I've felt a comfort from God and I've felt the support from other people, now it has shaped me and humbled me in a way that now I have a different kind of impact on people, because people sense the reality of somebody who's walked through that, the humility, I don't know, there's a gravity about somebody that has been through grief like that and healed, that people sense like, you get it. It puts people at ease. People are safe right away with someone like that. That you'll see them walk in and someone just automatically feels like they can tell them their whole life story, because a lot of times people sense that you get it, you understand how devastating it is to go through it. And so, it's not that there's a formula of what they say. There's just something about their spirit. When somebody has suffered deeply, they feel safe to someone who's suffering. And there's just a radar for that. So sometimes part of that healing is you start to see you're having an impact on others, and that God just dropped this person in your lap that comes in and all of a sudden starts opening up about like, I just lost my mother last week. And, it's like, how did this person just start talking about this to me in Walmart? Like, how did this happen? They'll have those kind of experiences. And it's like, but I know exactly what they're feeling because it just sounds like my story. And I'm like, well, I don't know the answer for yours, but here's what I did, or here's who helped me, or here's the book that I read. They begin to they just kind of get how to relate to that person because they've been in that pit. And so a lot of times that healing is like, okay, that wound is still there. That scar is still there, but I can talk about it. It's like, it doesn't overwhelm me anymore. I can get in there. I can talk about how hard that was. I can still be sad about it, but I can function now, and I can still see hope in it. And I've seen God do things out of that situation that it wouldn't have happened any other way, and in ways that He reached somebody and got to somebody through that death or through that grief that, I don't know if this person would have been saved if it wasn't for that thing that happened, kind of situations. And they kind of go, there's good that came out of it. And so we're seeing God work in it despite it still being a tough memory or a tough situation. And oftentimes that's usually at least after a year, I would say, in a grief situation, because you have to go through a calendar year of anniversaries. And I tell people, like, be prepared. That whole first year, there's going to be, even if you're getting better, there's going to be, this is our first, birthday, my first Mother's Day, or my first, Thanksgiving, or there's going to be those moments throughout that first year. So that's where you have to be kind of ready for the long haul of it. But yeah, there's a healing that happens that's, from my vantage point, it's beautiful to see it because it's complex. It's not the nice, and you can't wrap that up in 2 hours. Like, you watch a movie and it's like, oh, you sum this person's life up in 2 hours, and then you get to the end of it and it's like, they're all better, and see how great that was. And it looks kind of like the Lazarus story. Like, it ends very quickly. You read it, it takes you a few minutes to read it, and you get to the end and the nice wrap up story. And you're like, that was hard, but look what happened at the end. Right. And in real life, it doesn't happen that quickly. It might be years of wrestling with something, before you start to see that kind of victory in it. And to say, not just the 5-minute walk down to the tomb, not just the 5 minutes it takes to read this, but man, what if that's 10 years down the road before you see God doing something with it? And the endurance factor of that is really, that's part of the challenge, is being willing to persevere and keep walking through that and say, okay, I'm a little bit better today than I was yesterday, and I'll just keep going and see where God's going with this. That takes courage and endurance to do that.
Yeah, and ultimately, some of the markers I see in this story, you see those pop up at the end where Jesus is about to face his own death, and he's crying out to God to intervene in this situation that he's about to go through.
Yeah.
And that doesn't happen. And he's there and he's suffering and he's experiencing the absence and the loss, and he's going through those emotions. And then ultimately, his own disciples are having to struggle with that as well. And so I think for me, there's a comfort knowing that even if I'm going through something, I know that God has experienced that, and he knows what it's like to feel loss and to feel, abandoned and feel like there's no one there in the moment. And ultimately that's not where I have to live, and I can move forward, but it takes time and it takes patience, and it's not clean, and it's messy, and it's hard. And so just kind of finishing and wrapping up things, for someone that's listening and they're maybe starting to come to grips with the fact that they have something they need to, turn over and grieve over and start to actually experience those emotions. What would you say is the first step for someone like that?
I would just say, don't do it alone. On an individual level, I encourage people, I think journaling is great, or you find some expressive way to express, what is it? What am I grieving? What's going on? What am I feeling? Especially if you're someone, and I know it because I can be this way. Like I'm someone, those emotions aren't always close to the surface. So I have to dig a little bit when I've gone through grief periods myself. I have to dig a little bit to say like, I'm off, but I don't know exactly what it is that I'm feeling right now. I need to sit. Sometimes music helps me do that. Journaling will help me to do that, to just kind of express what's going on in my spirit. So I recommend people do some of that kind of work individually. But man, if you've got a deep grief that is there and you don't know how to deal with, you don't have to do that by yourself. I don't recommend doing it by yourself. We don't grieve well by ourselves. It's designed to be a community thing. And I think have people around you. And so I think it's great to find a counselor or somebody, or if it's a pastor or person, even if it's just a friend that knows grief. A lot of times people will be going through it and they'll be like, I have this other friend that she lost this person a couple of years ago, and I know she went through a lot, but she seems like she's really grown strong in it. Go tell that person. Mm. Partly it's a matter of who do you feel really safe to share it with. And so who is that safe person around you? Start there. The person you can be really open with. The person won't judge you for being a mess. Because I see Jesus' response to Mary, he doesn't criticize her, even though she's kind of irreverent in her response and she's criticizing, kind of questioning Jesus' decisions. He doesn't say, how dare you question me? Mm-hmm. I am Jesus. You back off. He doesn't say that. He's loving, and you see compassion in his response. You want that person to do that with you. You need somebody that's just going to be compassionate and understand. And so whether that's a friend, a family member, somebody, a pastor in a church, who is that person that you can do that with? Mm-hmm. And if nothing else, like a counselor may very well be part of that as well. Because the counselor can be kind of outside of the situation and help you gain perspective. Oftentimes I've played that role. So it's somebody that can help you see, this is why you're having trouble dealing with that. So I'm obviously a big fan of counseling. That's my background. So finding a person, though, somebody, I would say, even if I don't know if I'm ready to go do counseling yet, don't do it by yourself. Because if you got a deep well of grief to deal with, you're going to need some support. And you need somebody that you can call in the middle of the night when I can't sleep because I can't get this out of my head. If it's 2 a.m, who's the person that would answer the phone and let you talk? Mm-hmm. And, who's the person who's not going to gossip about you behind your back? The person who's not going to judge you because you're just, weeping and there's snot everywhere. It's like, who's the person that's just going to love you anyway in the midst of that? Go to that person and be brutally honest with what you're really feeling, what you're doubting, what you're questioning, what you're angry about. Don't sanitize it for that person. let them see this is the raw, unedited version of what's really going through me right now. This is the stuff that's going through my head all the time. So that you're not giving them the like pretty Jesus-y Christian version that sounds like a postcard. I'm giving you the real unedited version. Give somebody that raw version and allow them to walk through it with you. Because if you don't, it's going to be hard to resolve it. These deep kind of grief things, they don't resolve well by yourself. So that's the biggest thing.
Well, I appreciate you coming, talking a little bit more about this. For someone that's listening and they, want to talk to you more about that, whether it's, just from the church side of things, whether it's your sermon, whether it's finding a place to do these things in, or maybe it's on the counseling side and they're interested in learning more about that, where can people learn or contact you about some of those things?
Easiest way, you can email me. My email is mike@gccbartlesville.org. So you can always email me, and even if it's something I can't dive into, time is limited, sometimes there's schedule, but even if I can't, I always like to try and help point people towards something, or at least, try to help people sort through what's going on. I like being able to do that. So anybody, if me talking about it and bringing it up, and I put this whole issue on the table, and sometimes it's like, okay, now I can't avoid it because I'm a mess now. If you're feeling that, reach out somewhere. So certainly I'm happy to help somebody figure out what their next steps are going to be. The easiest way would be probably just to email me there. And then I can do that. So I'll be happy. To me, there's a great privilege in helping someone chart a course through that. So I would be happy to be a point person at the very least and help somebody figure out, okay, well, what do I do with this mess?
Well, thank you all for listening, watching, and engaging with us. I would highly encourage you, if any of this stuff resonated with you, reach out to Mike, reach out to someone, anyone, me. I think it's awesome that we've got people on our church staff with, the very different backgrounds, like counseling and different things that can talk about this, not just from a spiritual level, but from a real emotional level. And if you want to see more stories, people that have dealt with these things, on their own, you can look back, and there's plenty of people that I've talked with that have had some of these, hurts and big, issues that have come up in their lives that they've had to wrestle with. You can find those anywhere you listen to podcasts by looking up Grace Stories. You can find more of these here on YouTube. And if you want to find out more about our church, our social media is GCC Bartlesville, whether it's Instagram, Facebook. You can find links to everything, even to some of the stuff that Mike does, on our website, gccbartlesville.org. And we will talk to you next week.